Please welcome Dr. Arlene Sacks.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for coming. It's really a privilege to share my new book. I'm very excited. The Alchemy of Love and Marriage. And this book, just like my belief, is really about the fact that marriage or a relationship or a partnership, anything like that, is really sort of a balance between magic and logic. And keeping that in mind, which is not always easy, but it's the way I operate, I want to begin with the fact that I use fairy tales, not a lot, but as a parallel to the three different pieces that I believe you exist in a marriage: the early years, the middle years, and the later years. But I use some fairy tales to help with that. So I'm going to read you just about a page of why I use fairy tales, knowing that my philosophy is a little bit of magic and a little bit of logic. So fairy tales, in their simplest reading and most obvious interpretation, portray both genders in stereotypical manner. The ideal male is a savior, attractive and courageous. The ideal woman is infinitely beautiful and in need of rescuing. If we look more deeply into these tales, there is much more to discover. I will share how some very well-known fairy tales, Cinderella, Hansel and Gretel, as well as some lesser-known ones, offer messages about how to safeguard a relationship and help it survive enormous psychological and emotional challenges. I have chosen to connect fairy tales to my marriage as a way to explore what happily ever after really means and the toll it can take to achieve it. For hundreds of years, fairy tales have been cherished for their ability to transform a situation and with a single decision, change the outcome of a life or a relationship. All our favorite fairy tales include elements of good and evil, light and dark, dichotomies that serve as metaphors for our own journey. Fairy tales clarify for us the paths we must choose as we move through our life. They shed light on the nature of love and relationships and offer hope for a satisfying ending. So you can see that this book obviously is about love and relationships, but you can tell there was some cracks in it. And many cracks can be repaired, some cannot. And if it can, you will find the end result might be better than you ever imagined. So I refer to fairy tales beginning with Hansel and Gretel. And if you remember, Hansel and Gretel go off into the woods. And when they go off into the woods, they drop pebbles along the way. And that's how they get out of the woods. Pebbles stayed and they enjoyed the woods. They went together hand in hand. I believe they were a brother and a sister. They worked hard together. They played hard together. And out they came and everything was good. And I really parallel that to marriage. And that is what I call the early years. And in the early years, which are filled with a lot of chemistry and friendship and good times, and even if there are some small cracks, they're good. Our early years lasted about 9 years. And I use, also in the book, I utilize some sketches. And at the end of the early years, there's a sketch of a bench. And there's a man and a woman sitting on the bench together. And that's sort of the end of the early years, where there might have been some small cracks. And I share that with you through stories. I'm a very big storyteller. So I have concepts that I want to get across. because I want you to know about the book, but know there's a lot of stories involved in that. And so the next time Hansel and Gretel go into the woods, they drop breadcrumbs. And when they drop breadcrumbs, the birds come and they eat the breadcrumbs. And they can't find their way back. And in that experience, as they go in, dropping the breadcrumbs, they meet the witch. And how do they meet the witch? The witch, because she's magical, she creates a cottage. And the cottage has candy canes, cotton candy, ice cream, cookies, and Hansel walks right into the cottage and choop, the witch imprisons him. And then he's in a cage. Gretel is out of the cage because she was behind him. And I make that parallel to our middle years. And that cottage and the witch for us was the stresses that happen in real life. So in the middle years, those cracks are starting to widen. And the stresses that you face, for example, you may, in the beginning of the middle years, have children. And you love, when you have babies, you love them, that you have a love you never had before, they're great. Minus the fact that you have to do everything for them. They're totally dependent. So the nucleus that was you and your partner, 2, now may have 3 in it, 4 in it, 5 in it, and you go, uh-oh, we have to take care of this baby. And in addition, you may have teenagers in those middle years. Again, my middle years lasted about 10, 12 years, and you may have teenagers. For anybody in this audience who's had teenagers, I don't have to tell you about stress, but I will go back to it in a few minutes. Hopefully I can remember. Also at that time, you say, well, it's time for me to buy a house or a condo. And you can manage a down payment, you can manage the mortgage, you got it together, and you're in the middle years, you got these children, and you need a roof, or the pipes break, or the electric needs work. And now you've got the stresses because you were able to afford the house, but you don't realize all these things are happening. Forgetting about the fact that we have outside influences. For my husband and I, we were married late 60s, early 70s, and if any of you know anything about the 60s, you know it was the most tumultuous decade ever. Best music ever, let me be clear, but the most tumultuous time ever. Everybody who's laughing knows exactly what I'm saying. Where is the music? And so you have outside influences. So in our world, you can have a pandemic. You can have Hurricane Andrew. Forget all the others that come after. These are things that stress you. They're outside influences. And what also happens is, I've worked from the day I got married, but for many women who didn't, they had to get used to what sociologists call the second shift. And normally, not always, but the female is the caregiver. Not always, but in general. And I know in my time, you worked hard, and then you came home and you worked hard again. And that's what, as I said, the sociologists call the second shift. There's a reason. You got shift 1 working, and then you got shift 2. And when you work like this, you don't realize the stress. Even if you have a good job and things are good, you're working, your partner's working, and the cracks are getting wider, and they're getting wider, and nobody's doing anything wrong. Everybody's working hard, you're taking care of the children, you are doing what you're supposed to be doing, but the job, maybe one of you have to move for a job. Maybe you want to move up in the job. Maybe you have to leave the job. Whatever it is, it's a stress. So you've got all this stuff going on. You've had some minor cracks, but the cracks are getting wider. And again, nobody's doing anything wrong, but you're busy. You're busy doing what you need to do, your partner's busy doing what they need to do, and all of a sudden, the bench changes because you start arguing. Maybe it's the second shift. Maybe it's all the things I mentioned. But what happens is the cracks are getting wider and you begin to go sort of on separate paths. Unless you have a very lucky 50-year marriage and this doesn't happen. No one I know ever has not had this happen, but I'll give it to you that you might. Because if people are married 50 years, 40 years, 60, and they go, oh, my marriage was always great, they're lying. Lying. None of that is true. But okay, tell me whatever you want me to do. Oh, we're married 60 years, you know, we dance. You go, oh yeah. So even you go on vacation sometimes in the middle years and you figure, I'm not working, my spouse is not working. I'm not taking care of the house. We're going on a vacation. And now you realize, because you're going on a family vacation, you've got these children 24/7. Vacations don't always work right. And in my book, you'll see some, just like the honeymoon didn't work out right. The vacations didn't work right. So, again, it's nobody's fault, but you're falling apart. And, you know, in the early years, if you dance together, in the early years, you really sometimes we're doing a tango, everything's great, maybe you're waltzing nicely around the house. In the middle years, you're stepping on each other's toes. It's just hard. And so, if you look at the bench, okay, now the two of you are not sitting like at the end of the earliest, now you're sitting at opposite ends of the bench. So I did say I'd go back to the teenage stress, and I'll tell you a quick story, because like, as I said, I have plenty of stories, but in my world, I had, you know, a preteen, and because the cracks were getting wider, because we were getting a little separate, we started to argue. And we didn't argue a whole lot, but in the middle years, yes. And we also argued and we yelled at a certain point. And so this went on a bit. And one night we had an argument, wasn't pretty, and my husband and I go into our room, it's nighttime, and my children go upstairs to their room, go to sleep, and about 2 a.m., I hear somebody in the kitchen. And when I wake, I go, wait a second, I go into the kitchen, and there is my daughter. And I don't know how many of you remember or know Pepto-Bismol. Remember the pink Pepto-Bismol? Well, I go in the kitchen, and my daughter, firstborn, teenager, pre-teenager, she's swigging the Pepto-Bismol. And I don't know, I look at her and she's swigging the Pepto-Bismol. And I say, what's going on? And she looks at me and she starts shaking. And she says, you and Daddy never used to fight, you're fighting a lot now, and I can't take it, I can't sleep, I have a bad stomach. I said, whoa. I said, this stops now. I promise you that by the time you wake up in the morning, Daddy and I will have resolved this. Well, you know when they look at you, and they believe you, because you're the parent, and they're in a very bad state, but you look at their eyes and you know they don't really believe you. Everybody knows their own child. And I looked, and I thought, I don't know what I'm supposed to say here. I said it's going to be resolved. And we have a mirror right next to the kitchen. And I looked at her and I said, why don't you turn around a minute? And she turns around, and between her upper lip and her nose is a huge pink mustache. Huge! Thank God, Pepto-Bismol. And I look, and she looks in the mirror, and she starts to giggle. And I go, I'm trying to tell you, let's take this off. I'll take you back to bed, and I guarantee this will be resolved. So she does, and I go into the bedroom, and my husband said, what happened? I tell him exactly what I told you, and he says to me, whoa, not good. I said, good guess, not good. You know, kids in the kitchen swigging now Pepto-Bismol. So in the morning, there was never, and there wasn't any more yelling, and there wasn't any more fight. That ended immediately. To this day, I don't know what we were arguing about. I wish I could remember, because it would be great for the story, but I don't even remember. But the cracks already had widened. We were separate. And this went on as we sat on opposite sides of the bench. Now, if you go back to Hansel and Gretel, you realize we're getting ready for the later years. And what Hansel and Gretel did was, Gretel came up with a plan, but Hansel had to help with it. And so they managed to get him free because they worked together. They interlocked their fingers, and they were going to make a change in order to survive. And so Gretel has a plan, Hansel works with her, and together they escape. They get home out of the woods. End of the fairy tale. If you parallel that to the third, the end of the latest stage of marriage, I can't remember if it was exactly at the end of the middle years or the beginning of the later years, but it was so bad and we were operating so separately. I finally said to him, you have to leave. There is no love in this house. And I'll just divert for a moment and tell you, I look at love as three ways. You love a lot of people. You love chocolate, at least I loved. And you possibly, and I did, adore your partner. But in love is a different ballgame. And that's Arlene Sacks. And I was no longer in love. I knew he couldn't be in love. And it didn't exist in the house anymore. So I said, you have to leave. And first he was like, and it took about 6 days. And on Saturday evening, 6 days after I said, you have to leave, he said, okay, I understand. There is no love in this house. You don't want to be married to me anymore. I'll go. I said, okay. So he packs a very little bag. I don't know that you even own, maybe a Trader Joe's bag. So, he's got his little stuff. We don't know what we're doing. We're married from 20 to 47. Who knows what you're doing? But you have to leave. So off I said. And in my kitchen, there's windows that face the street. And he gets in the car, and he drives down my street, and at the end of the street is a stop sign. And at the stop sign, he'd be making a left, which he did, to leave. But he makes a left, and he does a U-turn, and he comes back into the house. And I looked at him, what are you doing here? He said, I don't know, I have to talk to you. I said, I thought we discussed this. He says, yes, and you're right, I am not happy either. You don't want to be married to me, and I understand that. I just don't know how to do it. I wasn't laughing at the time, because once he pulled out, I think that was the end of my life, the way I knew it. Not only were we married at 20, we were dating at 17. We went to college together. And so you got a long time. And he said, I just don't know how to do it. I know what the end result should be. I know we're going to be separate. I just don't know how to do it. And I looked, first I thought it was insane. I did. And then I said, okay, what does that mean? He said, you have to help me. I want to be a better man for living by myself, and also for you living by yourself, and that we can function. I said, okay. He said, so you have to help me. And of course, I loved my husband. I just was not in love with him anymore, and I didn't want to be married. But I would always help my husband. He was, my husband. but I wasn't gonna stay married. So he said, do you think we could at least go for a meal and discuss how I do this? So you have like Hansel and Gretel, basically. We don't know what we're doing, but he wants to go for a meal. I didn't want, but I said, okay. We go to a restaurant that's not in, shall we say, Kendall. It's far. It was a little French bistro, and it was early. And so it was quiet, it was empty. And I said, okay, this is your request, so you better tell me. And he says basically what I just shared with you. And I said, and I don't know what I'm doing, I don't know how I made this up in my head, but I created a plan. Trust me, I have no idea what I'm saying. I said, well, in honesty, and I'm lying because I don't know what I'm doing, right? I'm lying. I said, in honesty, one thing we could always do was have a conversation, because we were together since we were young. I said, we know how to have a conversation. So we're not going to use a therapist, and we're not going to use a psychologist, of which I've done therapy with people. But no, I said, we are going to have conversations. And then he looks at me, he said, what does that mean? So now I have to figure out what it is I'm saying, because I don't know. So I said, well, we're going to go for cafe con leche, because first of all, you must always remember Miami has the best cafe in the world. I don't care what latte you drink. It's the best. And we were big coffee drinkers. I said, we're gonna go for cafe con leche. We're gonna go every morning at 6:30 in the morning. And we're gonna sit on a bench at either a cafe con leche stand or a park, and we are gonna have a conversation. And I'm gonna go first. And then when I'm done with everything I wanna explain, then you can go. You can either respond to what I've said, or you can talk about what you think. But we're gonna have a conversation, and it's not gonna be 2 or 3 weeks. This is gonna take a long time to resolve. I'm making this up, remember this is all time. And so what was true was that we could always have a conversation, and that's what we did our whole lives. And that's what we did in the sort of beginning of the later years, the very later years. And so we had these conversations and sat on the bench, had the cafe con leche. Some of the conversations were not pleasant, and we had to leave the cafe con leche. So I will tell you, and it's sort of an analogy I make to what I explained to him was, aside from in our separate worlds, he was becoming more and more selfish because nobody was, dealing with him. I was no angel in this either. I knew something wasn't right. Again, middle years, too busy. Doing everything right, but busy. So I said, what happened to you is like a 3-ring circus. 1 ring is our marriage, 1 ring is our children, and 1 ring is your colleagues. And by your selfishness, you've lost everybody. Nobody would do you any harm. But all they do is they walk back away from you. And when they walk away from you, you could drown and nobody's sending you a life preserver. So what you have to do is figure out how to undo the selfishness. Because in a 3-ring circus, it may look, because there's 3 rings, like everything's disorganized. But don't think it is. The circus has created the 3 rings. They know. And what we are, Howard and I, are the ringmasters. We have to work together in order to have the 3 rings operate smoothly. So we're now going to be our own ringmasters in these circles so that we fix the damage. Because the circus and the ringmaster know exactly what's supposed to go on in the 3 rings. We're just busy looking, from one to the other. And that's basically how the conversations went. And it took almost 3 months of sitting on the bench, and it did work. At the end of 3 months, I said, okay, I don't need you to leave. And he said, I don't want to leave, this is my life. And he did everything he needed to do. So he was willing to change, we were willing to work together, and it worked. And I will tell you, in honesty, we had 20 more years together because I am a widow. And at the end of those 20 years, we were back as our own nucleus. Children got bigger, they left. In any case, it was just he and I, and it was great. And I'd like to read you a one-line quote. Let me share the quote. Your life at this exact moment is a direct result of choices you made once upon a time. Thank you. Thank you. Answering any questions or any thoughts you might have, I'd love to address them. Yes, me?
I didn't hear you tell us how long you were married, or did I miss that?
No, we were married almost 48 years.
Oh.
So this all happened, we got married at 20, the you-know-what hit the fan at 47, and we were married till he passed away at 66. Any other questions, any thoughts, anything you want to share? Yes, ma'am.
My other question is, when did you come to the perspective where you're able to analyze? We just left them. Some of us went to a marriage refresher a couple of weeks ago.
Good timing, good timing.
Nice. So when did you come to the realization that of how to analyze the 3 phases that you talked about? Were you analyzing those phases while you were married, or after he passed, you looked back and say, I can write a book about my life?
That's a great question. That is a great question, and I've been asked a lot of questions, and I haven't. That's a great question. I'll be very honest with you. The first book I wrote took 3 years, and that's about moving forward with the widow's journey. That's my first book. And that was really a mission. And when you have a mission, you don't think about anything other than, my mission was to help other widows. That was my mission. And I worked, talking about the book and helping people, et cetera, et cetera. And also what happened was, even though I know people die every day, I interviewed 13 other widows in this book, which I hadn't planned on. But as I interviewed them, they were from 32 to 82. So we have tons of people, different cultures, whatever. And I was happy to tell my journey, and then I could tell their journeys. I then talked about the book for about 1.5 years, 2 years, and then I was sitting one day, and it is in the book somewhat, where I realized, how did we ever last through this marriage? It was already gone. And I actually had to sit on the steps in my house. I have it upstairs and downstairs. And I sat on the steps, and I realized, because I have 3 concepts I talk about in this book, and I realized there's you, there's your partner, and I remember when it hit me, just like a bolt of lightning, what you're asking me. And I realized that there was me, there was he, and then there was the marriage. And the marriage, remember the old phrase, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts?
Yeah.
I was strong and had skills. He was strong and had skills. But the marriage, I said, that's how we stayed together. The marriage was bigger than either of us. And that's when I knew. I will tell you, I did speak to 4 people who are really big readers. And I asked them, and every one of them said, oh, no. It's because the 2 people, it's up to the 2 people. I said, well, you need the 2 people. But what I'm saying is a marriage, and I talk about this in this book, actually develops its own life. And people don't believe that, but that's what happened. I sat on those steps and I said, okay, here's your next book. And then I figured out, once I was thinking, I said, oh, well, it was pretty good in the beginning, then, not so good. And then it was great at the end. And that's how I did it. And I love fairy tales, I love quotes. I have really good quotes. Matter of fact, a friend of mine who read the book, I went and I visited with him, and he said, I want you to look at my notes section on my phone. I said, okay. And I look at the notes section, and he took all my quotes and put them on his notes section. There are people who love the quotes. But what they don't realize is when you write, and I have a very big writing process, takes me a long time. This book took me 2.5 years. And about almost a year to get it ready for the blessing of Amazon, shall we say. So I hope that answers your question.
It did.
Thank you.
It did. So in other words, it was after the marriage was over.
Well, he died.
Yeah. Okay.
So.
Yeah, that's. Yeah.
And I'm walking around because I had written the book, and people are asking me. And as I said, people die at every age. But not one of my friends because we were a little bit younger, we were in our 60s, not one of my friends had lost a spouse, male or female. So I didn't have any experience, so I became everybody's role model. People would walk over, what do you think? Oh my God.
That's one of the things I enjoyed about it, because you tell it from a retrospective, but we're, like, some of us are in it now, and it's nice to see that vision of like how marriage could be, and that's why I enjoyed the book so much.
Yeah, thank you. I know you mentioned. I think it's important because if I just told you all these good things about the marriage, yeah, we swam in the pool and I made a big party and I invited my friends when they had anniversaries and you have to know that there's truth. That's why my first book and this book are what we call nonfiction. They're not made up. All the stories are true. And if you tell the bad or the negative or whatever word you want to use, you're being honest. And there's an honesty that one has to present in a nonfiction. And if you're honest, people go, oh, that's what happened. So, thank you.
Thank you. Is there any other questions? Just so you know, we do have books in the library. Her books are in the library. If you want to check them out, we can request them for you. Are you selling copies?
I will
as well?
sell these books,
Yeah.
but you are going to, if you choose to buy one, you write a check to the Miami-Dade Public Library System, not Arlene Sacks. When I speak at a bookstore or I speak at a group, I'll be glad to take your money, but I'm not taking it today. Today, because I use the public library. And if we don't support our public libraries, heaven knows what's going to happen in the next 3 weeks. I've used the public library. I remember sitting on this floor with my son when he was little, and we were sitting on the floor doing science research. So, So to me, if you buy a book, fine, it goes to the library anytime I speak at the library. So other than that, thank you.